Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 37 of the Strokecast. You know, just a few days from now, October 29th, is World Stroke Day. So what are you doing to celebrate it or commemorate it? I would suggest, first of all, trying not to have another stroke, and secondly, be sure to share the FAST or Be Fast warning signs with friends, colleagues, and relatives to make sure that as many folks as possible know how to spot a stroke in the future. This week's episode features Whitney Morean. Whitney was a healthy, athletic 28-year-old in the summer of 2016. She voluntarily ran 5 miles a day. A bright student, she was excited to start graduate school that fall in clinical psychology. And then on August 23rd, 2016, everything changed. She had a mysterious hemorrhagic stroke in her right parietal lobe that would stump neurologists throughout the Seattle area. Grad school would have to wait. I initially met Whitney through the Seattle Young Adult Stroke Survivors Group. She had had her stroke about a year before I had mine. We ended up at the same hospital, and we ended up even having some of the same physical therapists and occupational therapists. A few weeks ago, we met up at the Wayward Coffeehouse in Seattle to chat. I'm thrilled to finally have her on the show. Now, let's meet Whitney. So Whitney, thank you so much for joining us here on Strokecast this week. I'm glad we could finally make this happen.
Yes, me too.
That's awesome. So, as I said in the intro, we first met through the Young Adult Stroke Survivors Group here in Seattle. And I guess let's start off with, you know, we know stroke just turns everybody's life upside down. So what was your life like before your stroke?
So before my stroke, I was less than a month away from getting ready to start graduate school in clinical psychology and working full-time as a case manager at a nonprofit in East King County that served folks that were transitioning out of homelessness.
Oh, wow.
And I'd been doing that for the past 3 years.
Wow.
And so
there's a ton of need for that in this community.
Oh my gosh, such a huge need for more affordable housing. So the day that I had my stroke, I was off from work because I was getting ready to take care of my father, who was going to have a full knee replacement, which was going to be his second full knee replacement. And I was in the process of moving from my house in Kirkland to my new house over in Seattle, which is going to be closer to school.
Okay.
And so it kind of spent the day doing some of the initial move-in process. And we had stopped to have a dinner break, and I started developing a pretty bad headache. And I had always had migraines. And so I just kind of thought, oh, this is going to be really inconvenient on the day of the move to have a migraine and not be able to help with more of the move. So I was just so I took some meds, hoping that it would pass and that I would be able to eventually kind of help back out again in the moving in process. But so I'd finished eating dinner and gone to the bathroom. And when I went to stand up from finishing going to the bathroom, I collapsed.
Ooh.
And retrospectively, what I think happened is that most people, when they stand up, are used to evenly distributing their weight between their left and their right. And all of a sudden, my right side was doing 100% of the work and was not equipped to do that. And so I just tumbled over to the ground. And my sister-in-law heard me fall and came in and asked if she needed to call my brother and best friend to come in. And I said yes. And so my brother then carried me to the car, and then my brother and best friend drove me to the Ballard ER because we were like little more than 2 miles from it and figured that we would get there faster than an ambulance would get to us.
Sure.
And on the way to the ER, I remember saying to them, I think I'm having a stroke. And I knew nothing about stroke. I later found out that my grandpa had died from a stroke, but didn't really know that at the time.
Uh-huh.
But I could just tell based upon the fact that half of my body wasn't working that something neurological was going on.
What's really great is we're starting to see just a lot more awareness among stroke, among younger folks, because well, obviously a lot more younger folks are having strokes these days, but just being able to have that as part of your vocabulary to recognize that. And when you got to the ER, did they recognize that that's what it was as well, or did they adopt the, well, you're young, it can't be a stroke?
Not right away, unfortunately. So it was not immediately diagnosed as a stroke, but I continued to deteriorate in the waiting room and subsequently started throwing up, and eventually was taken back and continued to deteriorate and was not able to, answer the questions that they were asking me, and have a memory of being wheeled out to the CT scan, which is where they were able to see that there was a massive amount of blood in my right frontal and parietal lobes.
Wow. You see, I think one of the things that's really interesting that a lot of people don't think about is that a stroke is not it happens and bam, you're just down. Mm-hmm. It's a progressive deterioration over the course of 5, 6, 12,
well,
24
it depends
hours.
where stroke happens. But yes, my deterioration happened pretty rapidly once I was obviously, it happened instantly in terms of the 1 minute I was standing walking to the bathroom, and the next I wasn't able to stand up at all. But in terms of the higher cognitive functioning stuff, that began to kind of go offline as I was at the ER and getting sicker and sicker. And then from Ballard was taken over to Swedish Cherry Hill to have the emergency craniectomy, where they removed a hand size of my skull and then put that in the freezer, not only to relieve the pressure, but also to suck out the, tennis ball size amount of blood that had accumulated from the bleed.
Wow, that is a lot.
Yeah.
Because your head isn't all that big to begin with.
No, it's definitely not that big. And so that's what causes the damage, is it's pushing on all the other stuff that's not supposed to get pushed on, and it's the size it's supposed to be. And so I then had my bone flap out for more than a month to relieve that pressure and to kind of let the intracranial pressure normalize before they then put it back on.
Interesting how that then has to be stored someplace, presumably not next to the lean cuisine.
Yeah.
I've heard in other cases where they've actually stored the bone pieces in people's abdomens.
I've heard that too. Yeah.
And I suppose you can't lose it that way.
I guess that's true.
But wow, so that's quite a thing. So what is it like waking up with? Did you have much awareness after the craniectomy? I
remember waking up while I was still intubated, because I remember trying to pull out my intubation tube and then having to be restrained because they don't want you to pull out your intubation tube. But I was then de-intubated by the second day that I was in the hospital. So I wasn't intubated all that long.
Okay.
And so they were then able to decide that I was, because they don't want to keep you intubated if they don't need to.
Right, absolutely.
And so I was then in the neuro ICU for, I think, 5 or 6 days.
Okay.
Just kind of until the fluid, the drain, because I had then a drain that was in my brain that was clearing out, and they couldn't take it out until there was no more blood coming out of it.
Right.
And they were at that point debating whether or not I needed to have a stent put in that would then drain, if there was still blood draining, that they would then drain it into my stomach. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, it eventually cleared, and they were able to get that taken out. And then I was just taken to the normal neuro floor before they were figuring out if I could do inpatient rehab at that point.
Right.
But anytime before I could even get moved, I had to get fitted for a helmet, because when you don't have a bone piece protecting your very tender brain, I had to wear a helmet when I was even just sitting up on the edge of my bed. And so before I remember getting fitted for the helmet, but I still, I was still pretty heavily medicated at that point.
Uh-huh.
Because it was quite a bit of pain from having your head cut open. So I have memories of having to relearn to sit up, to relearn how to try to stand and put any weight on my left side. I had both really bad tone which kept my foot in pointed, so it was hard to get my heel to be on the ground. But then I also had really bad clonus, which meant as soon as my heel was on the ground, it was bouncy.
Right.
And so it was really difficult to, even with like another person holding it down, to try to control my clonus, which was frustrating to then have to try to relearn to walk when your foot wants to be in a pointed position, and then when it is in a flexed position, it's bouncing. So
Right.
I applaud my physical therapist, because I swear most of that first 20 days they were carrying me around. But I was eventually, from the neuro floor, they did decide that it would be beneficial to do some of the initial acute inpatient rehab. And so from the neuro floor, I did 20 days of inpatient in the acute rehab at Swedish Cherry Hill.
Okay.
While my bone flap was out. And then they decided that the pressure had normalized enough and that the swelling had gone down. And so then they did the cranioplasty, which is putting the bone piece back in. And they decided that they didn't want to do the final 10 days of my acute inpatient stay right then, but they wanted to discharge me to a subacute facility because insurance was willing to pay for 90 days of subacute and only 30 days of acute. And so I was discharged to a subacute facility where I spent 20 days getting stronger before I was then brought back to the Cherry Hill campus.
So were they doing any rehab at the subacute place
Yes,
too?
they were. Yes.
Okay. So it's like getting you back to the point.
Yeah.
where
So
you-
I mean, there was a huge chunk of both PT, OT, and ST, which is speech therapy, at Cherry Hill before the cranioplasty. And then all three of those were also done at the subacute facility to a lesser degree and less intensity than at acute rehab. But still, I was doing them all every day, which was great.
Sure. And and that's what it takes. That's what you got. That's what you have to do to get back there. And I've talked before. I've always been really thrilled with the experience. Well, thrilled is an odd word to use, with the experience I had with the team over at Swedish. And they were always fantastic for me.
Well, especially during my first stay at the acute, all I wanted to do with OT was shower, because it was the only time my body felt comfortable. Because it was just like warm and peaceful, and I've always really enjoyed showers. And so I'm so grateful to, I probably didn't make as much progress initially with my arm because I just wanted to be in the shower, but it was worth it because my whole world had gotten flipped upside down.
Absolutely.
So finding something that feels remotely comfortable to when your body feels foreign and that you can't control it was definitely an important part of my recovery.
Right. So it's interesting how you mentioned your body felt foreign. And what do you mean by that?
I mean, I don't think you can really describe to someone who's never not been able to control part of their body what that feels like, but it just kind of feels foreign when it's like, I'm thinking that I want to move my left foot and it's not moving. It feels foreign. It feels like the sensation came back pretty quickly. So it wasn't that like topically it didn't feel like mine. It feels foreign because it's not moving.
It's just not obeying any of the instructions.
Any of the commands.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the ways I've tried to describe just trying to do this stuff in rehab to other folks is like, I tell them, okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to raise that arm that's growing out of the middle of your back now. You know, that third one you have? Put all of your effort into making that one move. And, because that's kind of what it felt like to me when I was, on the mat table and trying to work through some of that stuff.
I like that explanation because it really is. It really feels like you're asking me to move something that I don't actually have control over.
So that was just about 2 years ago that you're going through that experience. So how are you doing today?
I'm still doing outpatient PT and continuing to make gains, which is really exciting. Which is awesome because that means that insurance is still willing to pay for more PT. And I know that we're getting close to probably the end of insurance at least re-upping and continuing to cover that, but I feel really grateful that I'm still making gains, and I know that even once I'm not getting PT coverage that I can still continue to make gains because it really is just about putting the effort in, which I think is such a powerful thing that I think I understood a little bit initially, but I definitely early on was under the belief that you have 6 months, and where you're at 6 months is really what you got. And I'm thankful for the providers who helped dispel that myth, and for all of the things that I've read that have also helped dispel that false myth that is such a limiting belief for so many people.
Absolutely. And that is, that's great. What's really great too about the idea that it's the effort that makes a difference is that effort is something that for the most part you can control.
Yeah.
And you can do more and push more until you hit a limit, but you can always just then try to push a little bit past that as well.
I think it's just changing then your approach to what that limit is. Because I think that that's often the challenge, is that you reach a plateau, and it's not that you've reached a plateau, it's that you've reached a plateau with what you're doing, that you need to then approach it from a different angle.
So very cool. So you're getting all around the city of Seattle. We've got a reasonably good bus system here, and able to start getting back to your life. But your story has also been a fascinating one.
Unfortunately, yes.
Unfortunately, yeah. Nobody really ever wants to end up in a medical journal somehow.
No.
But there has been a lot of the neurologists have been really interested in your story. And can you talk a little bit about that and what's going on around that and why that is?
I'm interesting to neurologists because I was a healthy 28-year-old who ran 5 miles a day, who had low blood pressure, who had no pre-existing conditions, didn't smoke, didn't drink, and had a hemorrhagic stroke, and they cannot figure out what caused it. I didn't have an AVM. I've had a spinal tap, I've had 2 angiograms, and nothing has revealed any sort of explanation for what caused a healthy 28-year-old to have a stroke. And that sucks for me, because that means that I'm living in the unknown of it could happen again at any point. And it also is really difficult for other people to hear, but I'm not healthy and I'm older than that. What do I do? And it's like, I don't know. I'm not comforting you. No one's comforting me. So I think it's coming to kind of terms with the reality that, like, yes, take care of yourself, because the gains that I have made are because of my premorbid cognitive functioning and premorbid physical health. So it helped me in my recovery to be a healthy, engaged 28-year-old. But that didn't prevent it from happening.
Right. When we talk about the healthy lifestyles and everything, it's about reducing your risk, not eliminating it.
And I had 0 risk factors, so it can happen to anyone, which is kind of just scary, but that's the world we live in. Absolutely,
and it's also why it's so important for everybody in your household and your workplace to know to look for the be fast indications that somebody may be having a stroke. Be aware of it, even if you don't think you're at risk for it.
Right, and part of a little bit of my challenge now is that in addition to having a history of stroke, I then subsequently have developed epilepsy. And epilepsy, my symptoms will present pretty similar to a stroke. So I now have the added challenge, or not I, but people in my life have the added challenge of trying to now have to try to discern, is this just another seizure or is this another stroke? So, because it is a big deal, and especially if they're ongoing seizures. But thankfully, I've had 6, but they've stopped. They haven't been ongoing seizures. It hasn't been seizures that have rolled into each other. So it's been like an isolated focal seizure that's then stopped. But it has prevented me from driving. And so I'm really hopeful that come October, I won't have had another seizure, and then I'll be able to drive again.
Fantastic. I certainly hope that works out that way. You know, what's interesting is the way I understand the seizures post-stroke. In part, it's because the seizure is essentially when the electrical firing in the brain just goes all wonky. And one of the reasons it can happen with stroke, after stroke, is that now we have that chunk of scar tissue that's in there, and the nerves try to fire through it, and they can't, and it starts shorting out all over the place.
That has been one of the explanations I've heard. I also heard from my neurosurgeon that part of the reason that I likely continue to have ongoing seizure activity is because of the residual iron deposits that are in my ventricles that are left over from the blood that was in my ventricles from the stroke.
In the ventricles in the heart?
In the brain. So that you have ventricles in your brain that are supposed to just be filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And my stroke was both an ICH, which is an intracranial hemorrhage, with an IVH, which is an intraventricular hemorrhage. So I had blood that went into my ventricles, and they don't typically go down into the ventricles to remove the blood, but the blood that then just kind of sits there and apparently irritates it and doesn't go away. I feel like I'm still trying to become an amateur neuroanatomist through this whole process and slowly learning each time I go to ask more detailed questions, but the answer is you sometimes get seizures after stroke. That's kind of their takeaway, and we just try to medicate and manage them.
Interesting, and I just learned the brain has ventricles.
Yeah.
So now learning all sorts of stuff, and like I say, becoming an amateur neuroanatomist here. I'm just a marketing guy. I never knew I would know this much about neurology and neuroplasticity. What's the big thing you want folks to take away from your story of having the stroke and going through the recovery process?
I think for me, a big thing is I absolutely could not have done this without the incredible support network that I had. And I am so grateful for that. Of all of the people that were willing to come visit me when I was in the hospital, and including my family members who were willing to sleep on the very uncomfortable hospital cots because I just didn't want to be alone.
Sure.
And so they were just willing to stay with me, and friends that came and hung out with me while I was doing my endless hours of PT and ST and OT, and having an incredible support system. So if you know of someone that has a stroke, even if you don't necessarily know what to do, try to be helpful to them in whatever way you can.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And a lot of times it's don't ask them to tell you what you can do for them, because somebody who's having a stroke is dealing with so much other stuff. Yeah. And when you ask somebody what to do, you're giving them a job.
Yeah, you're giving them a job to come up with something for you to do. If you want to be helpful and they haven't proposed anything, take it upon yourself to work with a close family member to come up with a meal train, or some sort of, if maybe they need to get to medical appointments, coming up with a transportation system if that's what they need. Try to think beyond something just immediate that can get done, and kind of something that can make this person's life easier, and the lives of the people that are the caregivers, because as I'm sure your girlfriend has shared with you, it's a huge burden on the people in the lives of someone who've had a stroke. And so wanting to support them as well is really important.
Absolutely. And sometimes that can be as simple as volunteering to just go ahead and be in the home of the survivor while they sleep, so their caregiver can go out and just do whatever it is they want to do without having to worry. So you talk about you're back in school now at Seattle Pacific University.
Correct.
And you've changed your focus a little bit from the clinical psychology you were doing to, is it rehab psychology?
Yeah, it still is clinical psychology. Okay. It's just a sub kind of group within psychology.
So what is rehab psychology?
So rehab psychology is really a subspecialty within psychology that focuses on working with individuals with disabilities and chronic health conditions in order to maximize their health and welfare, independence and choice, and their functional abilities, as well as their social participation.
Okay.
And so it can kind of really be an array of things. And part of my interest in doing this is I didn't feel that I got that when I was at Swedish.
So how is that different from, say, OT?
So OT is specifically working on the body.
Okay.
So rehab psychology is more about kind of maybe it could be about accepting this new reality and kind of helping you do the coping piece. I am like other people who experienced pretty debilitating post-stroke depression, and can be an important member of the team to help remind people that, when something goes on in the brain, they might have some emotions behind it that we need to process. Right. And that's not to say that it is, that yes, some people do develop, pseudobulbar affect, but there are plenty of people that don't, that still have an emotional reaction that's like genuine to the experience that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. There's a grieving aspect to it.
Absolutely. Especially as a healthy 28-year-old, I was like not prepared to deal with the fact that half of my body didn't work and got really, really depressed. And am thankful for my family, especially my sister-in-law, who helped me get connected to a psychologist outside of the hospital that I could then start meeting with to kind of help work through that initial kind of stage, like you said, of grief, of grieving the life that I no longer had, and accepting that even if I get better, I'm not going back to the person that I was before my stroke. I'm a different person now. And working with a good friend who is in school for clinical psychology to remind me of one of the important things to do when you're feeling depressed is to get up and do things, even though it's the last thing you want to do, but the behavioral activation of forcing yourself to go do something, you will likely feel better. And it was helpful to have someone remind me of that in the depths of my depression, because I didn't want to do anything, and I also wasn't sleeping. It was a bit of rough.
Right. Wow.
So kind of addressing all of those pieces together is a big part of what helped me get through that initial part of the recovery. Well, there's such a stigma around mental health in general, and that the medical system's really good at, not great, but their focus is putting pieces back together.
Sure.
And we're not yet very great at integrating kind of the behavioral, emotional health piece of someone. Ideally, we'll get better, and hopefully as more rehab psychologists are involved in interdisciplinary teams, that will help, but it's not to the point yet where that was ever really addressed for me in the inpatient hospital setting.
It's interesting. One of the things I've come to understand a little bit more through this process is that the distinction we draw between physical illness and mental illness is really a lot fuzzier than a lot of people want to think about.
Absolutely.
And yes, there's definitely an opportunity for that. So that's great that you're doing that. And obviously the stroke has certainly inspired that change in career for you.
Yeah.
Or that tweak in your direction.
Yes.
Direction there. But going back to grad school, that's tough for folks in the best of circumstances. You've had your brain bleed, tried to kill you, had it opened up and had your skull stored in the freezer, put back in, and having to relearn the stuff most folks learn at age 1 of how to walk, how to get dressed, how to bathe. And now here you are in grad school, a very short amount of time. How has that been? How has Seattle Pacific really worked with you on that?
So before I was eager to go back to school from day 5 in the hospital, and was because at that point it was still before the previous year's quarter had started. And so I was initially unclear of how severe my stroke was. And so it took a little bit of convincing of people to be like, you're definitely not starting school this year. Maybe you can start at some point in the future. But it took a little while for them to convince me that I was definitely not going to school. But I'm very thankful that early on that people, even though I had very severe what's called left side neglect, which is not a cut in your visual field, but that you just don't attend to things on the left side of a paper and in the left side of your visual field at all. And it's pretty common after a stroke in your right parietal, which is part of where my stroke was affected. And so it wasn't that I couldn't read, it was that my eyes, I had to make intentional effort to get my eyes to track to the far left side of the page to be able to read. But then I also had a terrible memory early on, to where I'd read the start of a paragraph, and by the time that I got to the end, I had no idea what the first sentence had been about. And so it wasn't a comprehension issue, but it was a retention issue.
I was going to say, that sounds similar to folks who obviously it's a different experience, but if you're, ever find yourself when you're reading a book in bed or late at night or working through finals after you've been up for 42 hours and you just keep trying to read that same paragraph over and over again, and it just can't land because of that level of exhaustion, except you were experiencing that all the time regardless of how much sleep.
Yes, that's a good comparison of if you've ever tried to be relearning something and your brain is not retaining it, it's because you're tired, and my brain was just perpetually tired early on.
Sure.
And so I did outpatient speech therapy a little bit, but pretty quickly maxed out on what their really goal is. And I appreciate that the medical goal is to get you functional, but they don't really care beyond, okay, you can pass our pretty simplistic test. And going back to graduate school requires a little bit more than you being able to pass the okay, you're passing age competency. And so I had to do a comprehensive neuropsychological assessment before I was able to start school. But from that, my providers were able to kind of make recommendations to the school about what types of accommodations would be appropriate given my stroke and my residual deficits in terms of kind of processing speed and motor limitations. So always being able to have the opportunity to type rather than have to handwrite anything because I have such bad tone in my shoulder that causes pain. And so SPU has been great about working with the recommendations that my providers have given them to help kind of ensure maximum success. And unfortunately, they've had to add an additional accommodation around, now that I have seizures, of how do we deal with the fact that, if I have a seizure, I'm not going to class the next day because post-ictal recovery is not something that happens within 12 hours. And most of the time doesn't happen within 24, but it's like a 48-hour plus and likely more when you add in new medications. Mm-hmm. So they've added in the accommodation that I now get to work one-on-one with professors, that if I need additional accommodations around getting extra time because of my seizures, that I'm allowed to do that. And they've really just been great. It's been eye-opening because I've never needed I never needed academic accommodations before this, so it's been a very interesting process to kind of learn what that world is. Most people that are in graduate school that need accommodations have had accommodations their whole school experience. So it's pretty strange to come in at this level and have never needed an accommodation and having to kind of learn this process from the beginning, where most people have already done this. And I think that it does give me a really unique insight into when I hopefully am eventually a provider myself of what that process looks like for someone coming to me needing accommodation letter. Because it's not a straightforward process, and you have to know what types of accommodations would actually help you before you even go to your provider and ask them to write an accommodation letter. So it's been not only learning in terms of all of the incredible amount of new material that I've learned in graduate school, but learning how to navigate the accommodations world as well.
Right, learning how to study, and that's one of those interesting things where we were talking about this before we even started recording, was the idea that, for many years we were able-bodied and didn't have to think about this. And then suddenly this happens, whereas, some folks who, grow up with challenges mm-hmm. or onset earlier in life, you adapt into this, you sort of grow into it. Whereas with stroke, it's just like, bam, and mm-hmm. there it is.
And you still have to adapt, but I do think it is a different process when it's not in your formative years or not something congenital that you're born with, that it is a little bit, I think, different when it's something that happens in middle adulthood.
Right. You've gone from the world being adapted around you mm-hmm. to suddenly it no longer is. It's no longer built for
and
us.
Like you were saying earlier, your eyes open, because I initially was not really community level ambulatory. So when I would go out of the house, I was mostly in a wheelchair. And learning that, ADA passed, but that doesn't mean that actually everything is ADA accessible.
Right.
So your kind of eyes are opened into the reality of, okay, so you're saying that this is an ADA accessible bathroom and my wheelchair doesn't really even fit, and I have this small wheelchair? Mm-hmm. What happens for the person who has the normal size wheelchair? There's no way their wheelchair's fitting in this bathroom stall. Right.
Let alone turning around.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where there's a building downtown. Actually, it's a building where the American Heart Association has their office. And we were looking at the bank of elevators, and only one of the elevators is considered ADA accessible.
Because of the size?
Because it's a very old building. So it's pre-ADA, pre-World War II. But there's only the idea of being able to, get a wheelchair in there and then be able to turn it around so you can later on press a button or exit. It's a big deal. You don't even think about this stuff until you suddenly have to.
Yeah.
So that's been great, and I think that's the thing too about the ADA. I mean, it's one thing to issue accommodations because the law is compelling you to, but it sounds like Seattle Pacific has really gone. It hasn't been a case if you've had to go and ask them to do this because it's the law. It sounds like a part of it is they're happy to work with you.
Absolutely. And I do think that I'm in a unique position being in a graduate program about psychology. I kept saying if they aren't accommodating, there's a really sad irony to that. But thankfully had not had to deal with that. They've been really great.
So what advice do you have for new survivors and caregivers who are just being thrust into this world?
Well, be very kind to themselves. That it is incredibly exhausting, both emotionally and physically, for both parties. I think that we're starting to get a little more research around caregivers and understanding what that kind of caregiver fatigue can look like. And I think that that's incredibly important. And I also think it's really important to focus on the stroke survivor themselves and make sure that they are kind of checking in with themselves on what feels doable and recognizing when they've hit their wall of neurofatigue and realizing that sometimes you're just going to need a nap.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not trying and figuring out ways to slowly increase that endurance, but not being so frustrated with yourself early on that it's like, yeah, you used to be able to stay awake for 19 hours. That might not be doable right away. And not completely losing that as your long-term goal, but not being so hard on yourself that you aren't able to continue to make progress. So I think being kind to yourself, both as the stroke survivor and as the caregiver of caregivers need break, and take time and find other people that can help provide that support so that there's not just one person being the caregiver. Kind of disperse that load, I think, is really important. I think a big piece is also being really grateful for everything that you do have. So I think a big part of my helping me out of my depression was developing a gratitude practice, which involved not only kind of acknowledging everything that I had been able to achieve since being in the hospital, because I think that it's really tempting to want to compare yourself to where you were at pre-stroke. And so I learned to change that. My baseline comparison was not August 23rd, 2016. My actual baseline was August 24th, 2016. So my baseline was where I was at immediately after my stroke. And that kind of can give you the ability to kind of see all of the gains that you've made. And I think that starting as soon as you can, I know that it can be challenging because you have different kind of cognitive abilities, but even as a caregiver, kind of helping keep track of gains that get made can be a really important thing to do. And something that I started as soon as I got released from the hospital is like starting making lists of things that I can do that I couldn't do initially. And that can really help you keep you going when you're feeling like you're not continuing to make gains. I think is a really helpful thing. And then part of that gratitude practice is reaching out and thanking people that were really supportive to you during the initial part. And, for me, that was included being able to handwrite out my thank you notes with my left hand, which was my affected side, and being able to send those out to people as I was able to kind of not only cognitively stay engaged long enough to write a thank you note, but also to physically be able to do that with my left hand.
Well, that's great. That's great. And that also is also works out as a nice sort of therapy goal too, to be able to get to that point. It's one thing to do the thousands of exercises, but to actually have a reason to do that, that makes such a huge difference.
Oh, I think the practical applications of therapy are endless. I hate emptying the dishwasher and always have, but if you can turn it into like this is my part of my OT is being able to do it just with my affected hand, it makes that less of a chore and more of a like seeing the utility of being able to use that affected hand.
That's great. The other thing you mentioned the term age competencies in measuring therapy, and I think that's or measuring the goals the hospital wants to assess you against. The idea that is sort of based on the general population, what somebody in the general population at your age would be able to do. What I find interesting is that as a grad student, you're already more, for lack of a better term, more intellectually advanced than the general population. Yeah. And the idea that you're wanting to get back to that point as opposed to just where you're supposed, quote unquote, supposed to be from an age competency perspective. I think that's an interesting one that doesn't seem to be addressed much by therapy.
It definitely doesn't, and has been a big gap and something that I think I will continue to pursue on my own as both an academic interest and a very self-serving interest of I want to figure out how to continue to make those gains.
Awesome. The hospital, the medical industry wants you to be better. They're not necessarily as focused on helping you get back to your best. Get back to your best or get to extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's very true, though. Like, the way we have our medical system is set up to be able to, like, get you to be able to, like, put on your pants by yourself, and they don't really, like, and get you to be some sort of level of functional independence, but stroke survivors, there's not necessarily a huge goal of, like, getting you back to your pre-stroke functioning level. And I, as a 28-year-old, was not willing to accept that new lower level of functioning was where I was going to stay. But it was not because of the medical community that there was immediately like, this is what you need to do to get back there. It was a lot of like trial and error and me figuring it out on my own.
It's about you figuring it out. Yeah. You're doing your own reading, you're doing your own research, and you're just trying stuff and pushing yourself and doing that additional type of therapy for yourself.
So I think that's a big thing also is becoming knowledgeable about your stroke and your situation for caregivers and for stroke survivors of no stroke is the same, regardless if it happens in the same exact area in the brain as someone else's. Everybody's brain is organized based upon their life experience and what they've gone through. So knowing the area is helpful, but also knowing that there's no one that knows exactly what your recovery trajectory is going to look like, which is both scary, but I also think kind of liberating. Because it also means that there is no absolutes either way.
Fantastic. Neuroplasticity doesn't start when you have a stroke. It's something that's happening every day of our lives, from the time we're born until the time we die. And it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is a thing. And that's why everybody is so different. But
being able to harness it is like after a stroke is useful to understand how to do that, and working with care providers that understand based upon kind of what your goals are as a stroke survivor, what's most important to you right now, and that can change, but what's most important initially so that you can kind of know where to put that energy and effort, I think is a helpful place to start.
And that brings us to our hack of the week.
Patience and learning that things will likely take longer, and that can be through developing a mindfulness practice. As someone who was not terribly patient before their stroke, mindfulness has been a great way to help kind of increase that muscle. And patience really is a muscle, and I think that I didn't like hearing that initially. It made me kind of annoyed, but kind of learning to strengthen that can be important, and it's something that can be really simple and easy and doesn't have to be a 30-minute mindfulness practice. It can be really short and simple. There are a whole host of apps that you can do, or you can just do kind of a couple minutes or even just a minute of deep breathing, sitting quietly to yourself.
So if folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, what should they do?
They are welcome to email me at my email address, which is Morean, MOREANWM@gmail.com.
Fantastic. And we'll also have that link over at strokecast.com/Whitney. So Whitney, this has been great. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners today?
I think just make sure that if you as someone who has survived a stroke are feeling depressed, to make sure to reach out to care providers and let them know, because that is something that can be addressed in a multitude of different ways, and or reach out to a family member if you don't feel comfortable yet to reach out to a care provider, and or if you're a care provider and see and are concerned about the stroke survivor's mood, to help them, encourage them to address that with a medical professional so that they can receive the help that they need.
Awesome. Incredibly valuable and so important, and something that, I'm glad we're starting to get some more recognition of. And that is fantastic. And this has been an awesome chat. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's always great to talk with Whitney. She does a great job of expressing her thoughts in concise, thoughtful phrases that also makes her incredibly tweetable. So what aspect of this conversation interests you the most? Let us know in the comments over at strokecast.com/Whitney. Share this episode with a friend, caregiver, or grad student by directing them to strokecast.com/Whitney. If you're feeling depressed or having challenges dealing with grief or emotions after stroke, let your caregiver or medical team know, because there is help available. Be patient with yourself, and of course, as always, don't get best. Get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.